France, December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay under a blanket of fresh snow, the air heavy with smoke and disbelief. Along a narrow country road, an American Sherman tank stood half-buried in mud, its armor scarred, its turret still smoldering from a glancing shell. Nearby, a group of German tankers, mud-streaked, exhausted, and newly captured, stared at it as if at an apparition. One of them, his face still blackened with soot, whispered to his comrade, "Das ist unmöglich." Impossible. For years, they had been told that the Sherman was a joke, an under-armored, undergunned death trap that burned at the first hit. Yet here it was, still intact after taking 2 direct strikes from a Panther's 75mm gun. The American crew, grinning and shivering in the cold, offered them cigarettes. The Germans refused. They only wanted to see the tank again, up close, to touch the armor that wasn't supposed to survive. They thought it had to be a trick. The truth, however, was far more complex than propaganda ever allowed. In the early years of the Second World War, the idea of the perfect tank was still forming. Europe's battlefields were laboratories of steel, where doctrine and design collided in deadly experiments. When Germany rolled across Poland in 1939 and then into France in 1940, the world watched the speed and coordination of blitzkrieg rewrite every rule of armored warfare. German Panzer III and I-4 models, light by later standards, relied on tactics rather than sheer armor. They worked in concert with aircraft, artillery, and mechanized infantry, a moving fist that shattered slower armies before they could react. Across the Atlantic, the United States was watching closely. America's tank program in 1940 was, still modest, built on limited experience and interwar neglect. The M2 medium tank, with its high silhouette and thin armor, was already outdated before it left the factory. Yet within 2 years, American industry would transform this weakness into overwhelming strength. The answer was not a monster tank, like the German Tiger, but a balanced machine that could be built by the tens of thousands. The world soon met that answer, the M4 Sherman. When it entered service in 1942, the Sherman seemed almost ordinary. It had a 75mm gun, 51mm of front armor, and a Continental radial aircraft engine. None of these features stood out individually, yet together they created something remarkable: reliability. A Sherman could drive hundreds of miles without mechanical failure, something no Panther or Tiger could promise. Crews could replace broken parts in the field, and mechanics could cannibalize one tank to fix another within hours. This practicality fit perfectly with American logistics, the most efficient supply network the world had ever seen. By contrast, German tank design followed a different philosophy: perfection through complexity. When the Panther appeared in 1943 at Kursk, it stunned Allied observers. Its 75mm KBT-42 gun could destroy a Sherman at over 1/500 meters. The Tiger, heavier still, became a legend, its 88mm gun cutting through Allied armor like paper. On paper, these machines made the Sherman obsolete. In propaganda, they made it laughable. German crews gave it cruel nicknames: Ronson, Lights Up the First Time, or Tommy Cooker. Yet by 1944, numbers told another story. For every Tiger I produced, Germany could build only a few dozen before parts shortages and factory bombings halted production. The United States, meanwhile, could roll 2,000 Shermans off assembly lines in a single month. They came from Detroit, from Cleveland, from Chicago, each identical, interchangeable, and ready for war. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Over 4,000 Shermans rolled ashore. They met stiff resistance: the hedgerows, the anti-tank guns, and the dreaded Panthers. Crews learned hard lessons. They learned to flank instead of duel head-on, to call for artillery or airstrikes when the enemy's armor was too strong. They learned that survival depended on coordination, not invincibility. By winter, that lesson had reshaped the front lines. The Sherman was no longer a joke. It was the backbone of an army that refused to stop advancing. Its crews fought not as lone knights, but as teams, each tank part of a vast, synchronized system of war. And as the snow began to fall across the Ardennes in December 1944, those lessons would be tested one final time. The German army, desperate and defiant, was preparing its last great gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. The Sherman would meet the Tiger and Panther once more, not on the open plains of Russia or the sands of Africa, but in the frozen forests of Western Europe. What began as an engineering competition would now become a test of will, endurance, and adaptation, a contest between two ways of thinking about war itself. By late 1944, the war in Europe had entered a brutal rhythm. Germany was cornered, its once unbeatable Wehrmacht retreating through France and Belgium toward its own borders. But the illusion of collapse was deceptive. Behind the front, in forests and factories, the remnants of the German war machine were regrouping. The Allies believed the Reich was nearly finished. Adolf Hitler believed the opposite. He planned one last, desperate strike to split the Allied front and force a political settlement: the Ardennes offensive. In those cold weeks of December, American and German tanks would face each other not as machines of distant battlefields, but as predators in the same forest, blind, tense, and only meters apart. For the Americans, the M4 Sherman had become the universal answer to every tactical problem. It carried a 5-man crew: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver. Inside it was cramped, noisy, and hot, or in the Ardennes, freezing. The engine roared like an aircraft, drowning conversation. When it fired, the 75mm gun sent shock waves through the hull, rattling the teeth of every man inside. Yet crews grew to love it. They gave their tanks names: Fury, Omaha Kid, Texas Belle. It wasn't superstition, it was survival psychology. The Sherman wasn't the best tank on the battlefield, it was their tank. Across the line, German armor looked like a different species. The Panther weighed over 45 tons, its long-barreled 75mm gun able to pierce a Sherman's front armor before the Americans were even in range. The Tiger I and Tiger II were heavier still, near 60 and 70 tons, with frontal armor thicker than the Sherman's entire turret. To Allied troops, these tanks were monsters. The sight of a Tiger on the horizon could freeze an entire battalion. Yet what soldiers feared, mechanics cursed. German tanks were engineering marvels and nightmares to maintain. Their engines overheated, their transmissions failed, and their tracks cracked under stress. On long marches, Tigers often broke down before ever seeing battle. Every kilometer cost them time, fuel, and men. The Sherman, by contrast, was a soldier's machine. It could be repaired in the field, refueled quickly, and operated with minimal training. When bogged down, a Sherman platoon could winch each other out. When hit, their crews often survived. The tank's gasoline might ignite, but the escape hatches and turret design gave precious seconds that German tanks rarely offered. These differences weren't accidental. They were philosophical. The American design prioritized the war as it truly existed: fast-moving, supply-driven, and fought by citizen soldiers, not elite panzer divisions. German engineers built for perfection. American engineers built for production. By December 1944, that philosophy filled Europe. More than 49,000 Shermans had rolled off American assembly lines. Entire divisions of identical tanks could advance, retreat, and refit as one organism. If one was lost, another took its place the next morning. The German army, with its dwindling factories and fuel reserves, could not replace its losses. But in the forests of the Ardennes, terrain changed everything. Visibility dropped to mere yards. Snow muffled sound. Engines stuttered in the cold. Air support, the Allies' greatest advantage, was grounded by bad weather. For once, the Americans would fight blind, tank against tank. On December 16, 1944, the German offensive began. Over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 armored vehicles stormed through the mist and snow. The spearhead formations, Kampfgruppe Piper among them, sought to punch through thin American lines and reach the Meuse River. In their way stood small, scattered U.S. armored units, outnumbered, outgunned, but not unprepared. Among those units were crews from the 4th Armored Division, the 37th Tank Battalion, and the 10th Armored Division, whose Shermans had learned hard lessons since Normandy. They fought using speed, ambush, and coordination with infantry and artillery. Each Sherman carried radios, something most German tanks lacked, allowing them to call for fire within seconds. These were the crews who would later capture the U.S. German tankers that day, the ones who begged to see the Sherman's armor again. To them, the sight of an American tank still standing after being hit twice was more than surprise. It was a fracture in their belief. For years, German propaganda had painted Allied tanks as inferior toys of an industrial giant. Yet now, as smoke drifted through the Ardennes, reality overturned ideology. The Sherman wasn't a miracle of engineering. It was a miracle of understanding. A weapon designed not for show, but for endurance, for men who had to fight and live every day. As the fog thickened, the myth of German invincibility would meet the relentless logic of American production. And within that clash, one battle would reveal how much more dangerous simplicity could be than perfection. For both American and German crews, life inside a tank was a world of confinement. Heat, fumes, deafening noise, and constant uncertainty. The tank was both a weapon and a coffin, depending on the day. The difference was not in what they faced, but in how they faced it. American Sherman crews were often young, farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, or clerks from New York who had learned to drive a tank in just a few months. Many had never seen combat before Normandy. Yet, by late 1944, they were veterans of ambushes, minefields, and close-range duels in hedgerows. They had learned, through hard experience, that their survival depended not on armor thickness, but on teamwork and calm under pressure. Inside the Sherman, space was tight, barely enough to stretch one's legs. The air smelled of oil, cordite, and sweat. When shells struck nearby, the vibrations passed through the floor like thunder under their boots. The loader's hands moved instinctively. Reach, shell, slam, lock. The gunner's eye never left the sight, waiting for the brief second when the world outside aligned with the crosshair. The commander's voice, steady despite the chaos, gave orders. Left, fire, reverse. What kept them alive was not bravery alone, but a quiet understanding. The machine will not save you. Only each other will. German tank crews, by contrast, were professionals. Veterans of years of campaigns from Poland to the Eastern Front. They were trained in precision, drilled relentlessly in maintenance and gunnery. Many served in the elite Panzer Lehr Division or in the 2nd Panzer and 12th SS Panzer Divisions. To them, tank warfare was an art form, an exact science of range estimation, angling, and mechanical mastery. But by late 1944, Even the best training could not overcome exhaustion. Fuel was scarce, spare parts rarer still. Some German tankers entered battle with only a handful of shells and orders to conserve ammunition. They admired their machines, the sleek, sloped armor of the Panther, the immense power of the Tiger. But they also feared them. Each breakdown, each cold start felt like a gamble. The war had become a test of patience and endurance. When the Germans met the Shermans in the Ardennes, they expected an easy victory. They had heard stories that American tanks ignited instantly, that their crews fled at the first hit. Instead, they met men who fought with methodical precision, who didn't panic when shells ricocheted off the hull, who used radio coordination to flank and encircle them. The Germans' psychological advantage began to crack, and when their own tanks were knocked out, many were stunned not by the firepower of the Americans, but by the organization, how fast replacements arrived, how efficiently damaged tanks were towed and repaired, how quickly the Shermans seemed to multiply. For the first time, they were not fighting individual tanks, but an industrial system that never stopped moving. For the captured German crew who begged to see the Sherman again, it wasn't curiosity, it was disbelief. They had just witnessed a tank they considered inferior survive 2 direct hits. That moment shattered years of propaganda. They realized that the Allies' strength wasn't in invincibility, but in relentlessness. The tactical angle, doctrine, and the art of coordination. The difference between a Tiger and a Sherman was often less about design and more about doctrine. The German army believed in decisive engagements, tanks as the spearhead of attack. The U.S. Army saw tanks differently, as one part of a greater machine. American doctrine emphasized combined arms warfare. Shermans rarely fought alone. They operated alongside infantry, engineers, artillery, and aircraft, each covering the weaknesses of the other. If a Panther held a strong defensive position, Shermans would pin it, while ground troops called in artillery fire or airstrikes. If roads were mined, engineers cleared them under tank cover. If a tank was immobilized, recovery teams retrieved it under smoke cover within hours. The Germans, however, fought in smaller, isolated formations. A single Panther platoon might strike hard, destroy several Shermans, then run out of fuel or ammunition before reinforcements arrived. Each engagement was a tactical masterpiece, but strategically meaningless. The Allies could afford losses. The Germans could not. This doctrine played out clearly in battles like Ardennes in September 1944, where the U.S. 4th Armored Division faced over 200 German tanks and won. Visibility was poor, and the fog of war literally hung over the fields. But the Americans, guided by radio and flexibility, outmaneuvered the heavier Panthers. Shermans struck from unexpected angles, withdrawing before the Germans could respond. In 2 weeks, they destroyed more than 250 German tanks and assault guns while losing fewer than 50 of their own. The same tactics carried into the Ardennes. American commanders like Creighton Abrams and John Shirley Wood taught that the Sherman's speed and coordination were its true weapons. They treated the battlefield like a chessboard, where the Tiger was a queen, powerful but slow. The Sherman was the knight, nimble, unpredictable, and everywhere at once. That philosophy didn't just win battles, it saved lives. By the winter of 1944, every American tanker understood that the Sherman was not designed to go head-to-head with a Tiger. It was designed to outthink it, outlast it, and, with support, destroy it through numbers and coordination. And so, as snow covered the forests and engines roared to life, both sides prepared for a confrontation neither truly understood. The Germans believed they would crush the Americans again, as they had in 1940. The Americans believed they could hold, and prove that simplicity, when mastered, could be deadlier than complexity. Every tank on the battlefield was a compromise between 3 competing forces: firepower, armor, and mobility. The Sherman and the German Panthers embodied two extremes of that triangle. The Panther, introduced in 1943, was a masterpiece of German engineering. Its 75mm K-42 L-70 gun could penetrate 120mm of armor at 1,000 meters, more than enough to destroy a Sherman long before the Americans could return fire. Its sloped frontal armor, 80mm thick, could deflect shells that would have torn through earlier models. From the front, the Panther was almost invincible. From the side, it was still formidable. The Tiger I and Tiger II, with their 88mm guns, were even more feared. Their shots could pass through multiple Shermans in a single hit. Yet these tanks came at a cost. Each was a technological monument, heavy, slow, and mechanically fragile. The Tiger II's transmission frequently failed within 500 miles. Fuel consumption was catastrophic, requiring over 500 liters for a single day of combat. The M4 Sherman, by contrast, was not designed to dominate, but to endure. Its 75mm gun could penetrate about 75 meters of armor at close range, barely enough against a Panther's front. But its turret traversed faster, its suspension handled rough ground better, and its engine could run for days without failure. It weighed 30 tons, half a Tiger's mass, and could cross bridges and soft ground the Germans avoided. The Americans also innovated constantly. As new threats appeared, the Sherman evolved. The M4A3E8 EZ-8, with a 76mm gun and improved suspension, appeared by late 1944. Its shells could penetrate the Panther's side armor at combat range. The addition of wet ammunition stowage reduced fires drastically, a direct response to early war losses. But the Sherman's greatest technological weapon was not a component. It was standardization. Every Sherman shared interchangeable parts. A destroyed tank's gearbox could repair another. Factories across the U.S. produced identical components, meaning an engine from a Detroit plant fit perfectly in a Sherman from Cleveland. The Germans, however, produced multiple overlapping models, each requiring unique parts and specialized maintenance. In war, perfection became a liability. Optics told another story. German Zeiss sights were clearer and more precise. Their gunners could hit at long range with frightening accuracy. American optics were simpler but faster to adjust. Many U.S. tankers learned to fire on the move, trusting instinct and volume rather than precision. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. A reflection of America's industrial and cultural philosophy: speed and adaptability over complexity. As one captured German officer later admitted, the Sherman was not a tank. It was a system. It didn't win through armor or firepower, but through the invisible web of production, transport, and repair behind it. The moral and psychological angle, belief and disbelief propaganda, had long painted the Sherman as inferior. German soldiers were taught that Allied tanks were mass-produced junk, crude by amateurs. The Tiger was the symbol of superiority, the embodiment of Aryan engineering triumph. That belief carried morale, even when fuel and ammunition dwindled. For American crews, the opposite was true. They entered battle knowing the odds were against them, and yet they fought on. Many Sherman crews developed rituals: lucky coins, photos of loved ones taped to the periscope, prayers whispered before each round. They understood the fragility of their machines, and yet they climbed in willingly. This awareness forged a different kind of courage, the courage of ordinary men in imperfect machines. The German crews who begged to see the Sherman's armor again did so because the experience challenged everything they believed. They had fired twice. The rounds struck. The armor held. The Americans advanced, returned fire, and lived. The Germans could not understand how. It wasn't witchcraft. It was physics and tactics. The Sherman had angled itself perfectly at the moment of impact, increasing its effective armor thickness. The slope, combined with mild steel flexibility and internal reinforcement, had absorbed the energy. What the Germans saw as a miracle was simply good training. But beneath that disbelief lay something deeper: fatigue, despair, and the creeping realization that Germany's war was unwinnable. For them, seeing a Sherman survive meant more than losing a duel. It meant the collapse of faith in the invincibility of German arms. Many Allied soldiers, too, carried scars from earlier encounters with Tigers and Panthers. They knew how it felt to be outgunned. They watched comrades burn inside their tanks. But each engagement taught them something new. They adapted. They changed angles, used cover, coordinated with infantry. What the Germans mistook for luck was learning. Collective, institutional learning at scale. In that sense, the Sherman represented not just a tank, but the Allied mindset: resilience, iteration, and the refusal to stop advancing no matter how imperfect the tools. When the captured Germans stared at that mud-streaked Sherman and whispered, "It must be a trick," they were confronting not an enemy machine, but an idea: the triumph of practicality over perfection, of systems over symbols. And as the Ardennes offensive deepened, that realization would play out again and again, in villages, fields, and forests, until the myth of German armor superiority was broken completely. The moment of reckoning would come soon. In the frozen dawn of December 1944, both sides would commit everything to a single, desperate push, the turning point that would decide not just the fate of the offensive, but of armored warfare itself. December 19, 1944, near the village of Margaret, Belgium. The morning began with fog so dense it seemed to muffle the sound of war itself. Trees stood like gray ghosts, their branches heavy with snow. Along a narrow forest road, the 2nd Panzer Division advanced cautiously. Engines low, exhaust clouds merging with mist. Ahead of them, scattered units from the U.S. 10th Armored Division prepared their ambush. Their orders were simple: delay, disrupt, survive. In one of those Shermans, Sergeant James Donnelly sat in the commander's cupola, scanning the tree line. He had 18 shells left, mostly armor-piercing, a few high-explosive. The tank's 75mm gun had been cleaned the night before. The crew, veterans of Lorraine and Nancy, knew the odds. Somewhere beyond the fog, a Panther platoon was moving toward them. At 8:12 a.m., the first shot echoed through the valley. A German shell screamed overhead, detonating behind them. Snow and soil rained down on the hull. The Sherman lurched backward, engine growling. Then Donnelly saw it: a dark silhouette moving between trees, long-barreled gun aimed directly toward them. Panther, 12 o'clock. The Sherman fired first. The shell hit the Panther's sloped glacis plate and ricocheted harmlessly into the woods. The German tank returned fire. The impact hit the Sherman's right track, snapping links and immobilizing it. But the crew stayed calm. Smoke filled the compartment, the loader coughing, the driver shouting for direction. Donnelly didn't flinch. Traverse left 3 degrees. Load AP. Another round chambered. Another flash. This time, the shot struck the Panther's turret ring, a weak point. The German guns stopped moving. A second later, the Sherman fired again. The Panther erupted in smoke. The victory was brief. 2 more German tanks emerged through the fog, their barrels cutting through the haze like dark spears. The Sherman was still immobile, its right track severed. Donnelly's crew had seconds to act. They angled the hull, turning the front armor toward the enemy. A maneuver every American tanker was taught. It wasn't superstition. It was survival geometry. The first Panther fired. The shell hit the Sherman's frontal plate with a shriek, but it didn't penetrate. The crew inside froze, waiting for the explosion that never came. The impact dented the armor, but the slope deflected most of the energy. A second round followed. Again it struck. Again it failed to pierce. Inside the German tanks, confusion rippled. 2 hits, both solid, and the target still stood. Through their periscopes, they saw the Sherman's armor blistered but unbroken. They fired again, and again, the same result. Then, from the tree line behind the Americans, another group of Shermans opened fire. The Germans, fixated on their target, didn't see the flanking movement until it was too late. High-velocity shells tore into their side armor, the one place even a Sherman's 75 mm could penetrate. One Panther caught fire instantly. Another spun in place, its tracks shredded. The fog cleared just enough for the Americans to see the battlefield. 3 German tanks burning, 2 Shermans disabled, 1 still fighting. The air reeked of cordite and gasoline. When the battle ended, 8 German crewmen were captured, including a Panther commander named Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Krüger. He refused food, refused water, but asked one thing: to see the American tank he had fired upon. The request puzzled the Americans, but they agreed. Krüger and his crew were led back to the Sherman they had engaged. The vehicle's front was cratered and scorched, but intact. He ran his hand along the armor, muttering in disbelief. He looked for hidden plates, tricks, extra layers welded beneath. There were none. "It's impossible," he said quietly in German. "No tank can take that." To him, the battle had broken logic. For years, he had trusted in German engineering, in the supremacy of armor and firepower. Yet, here stood a mass-produced American machine that had survived what no Tiger or Panther was supposed to. His disbelief was more than technical. It was existential. What Krüger didn't know was that Donnelly's crew had angled the Sherman's hull precisely at 45 degrees during the hits, doubling its effective armor thickness. The Panther's shells struck at poor trajectory and lost their penetrating power. It wasn't luck or trickery. It was training, doctrine, and calm execution under fire. That moment, when myth collided with physics, echoed across the Ardennes that winter. Dozens of similar encounters unfolded. Outnumbered Sherman units stalling German advances, buying time for reinforcements, proving that speed, coordination, and discipline could overcome even the heaviest armor. Each engagement chipped away at the illusion of German invincibility, and each surviving Sherman told the same story: endurance over dominance. In the coming days, that truth would reach its peak in one of the fiercest, most chaotic tank battles of the Western Front. December 23, 1944, near the town of Celles, Belgium. The snow was stained black with oil and ash. Wrecked vehicles lined the hillsides, half-tracks, trucks, tanks of every shape. The Battle of the Bulge had reached its most desperate phase. For days, the German advance had pushed deep into the Allied lines, but now their spearheads were running out of fuel. The fog had lifted, and the skies filled once again with the thunder of Allied aircraft. Below, on the ground, another thunder rolled. The clash of tanks. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, known as Hell on Wheels, had moved to cut off the German 2nd Panzer Division near Celles. Their Shermans approached from the west, while British units blocked the north. Trapped between converging forces, German tankers dug in, turning every ridge and village into a fortress. For the crews on both sides, it was no longer strategy. It was survival. Among the American formations was a platoon under Lieutenant John B. Taylor. His men had been fighting almost non-stop since December 17th. Their Shermans were battered, their engines whining from overuse, but morale remained steady. They knew that if they could stop the Panthers here, the German offensive would die with them. At dawn, Taylor's platoon advanced through the frozen valley. The ground trembled as the first German guns opened fire from the tree line ahead. Shells ripped into the snow, sending geysers of earth and metal into the air. A Sherman on the left flank exploded, its turret thrown 10 meters away. The rest pressed forward, using the smoke as cover. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Taylor shouted through the intercom. The driver gunned the engine, slewing the tank around a ditch. Ahead, a Panther appeared, black cross stark against white snow. Its barrel turned slowly toward them. The Sherman's gunner didn't wait for orders. He fired. The shot struck the Panther's mantlet and bounced off. The return shot came instantly, slamming into the Sherman's lower glacis. The tank shuddered, its crew thrown forward. But the armor held. Taylor's platoon fanned out, coordinating over radio. Artillery support was on standby, but communications were chaotic. The forested terrain distorted signals. They fought blind, relying on instinct and the knowledge of how their tank moved, sounded, reacted. Another Sherman flanked wide, using a hedgerow for concealment. Its 76mm gun, upgraded for late-war models, fired a high-velocity round into the Panther's side. The German tank erupted in flame, ammunition cooking off like fireworks. The blast echoed for miles. Nearby, another German unit, elements of the Panzer Lehr division, tried to reinforce the position, but their fuel trucks had been destroyed by fighter bombers hours earlier. The Tigers that managed to reach the line had only enough fuel for a few kilometers of movement. Some commanders ordered their crews to fight static, turning their tanks into immobile pillboxes. Others simply abandoned them, setting demolition charges before retreating. For the Americans, momentum was shifting. By noon, the Shermans had broken through the first line of defense. The sky was now alive with P-47 Thunderbolts diving through smoke, strafing columns of retreating vehicles. The combination, tanks on the ground, aircraft overhead, was exactly what U.S. doctrine envisioned. Combined arms in perfect synchronization. Yet, for the men inside the tanks, victory didn't feel like glory. It was noise, exhaustion, and the sickening smell of burning fuel. Inside Taylor's Sherman, the radio crackled with scattered reports. Enemy withdrawing. Multiple Panthers disabled. Watch for infantry with Panzerfausts. The battle continued into the evening. As darkness fell, the surviving German tank crews, including several from Kruger's battalion, surrendered. Many wept as they walked past the rows of functioning Shermans. They had fought believing they were the masters of armored warfare. Now they faced defeat, not from a superior machine, but from relentless organization and overwhelming coordination. One American mechanic later recalled walking among the wrecks. He found a Panther that had fired its last shell before running dry. Inside, the crew's notebooks were filled with range calculations, perfect math, perfect alignment, all useless in the face of logistics. He shook his head. They built tanks like watches, he said, and we built ours like hammers. Guess which one lasted longer? By December 26th, the German 2nd Panzer Division was destroyed as a fighting force. Over 60 Panthers and Tigers lay wrecked or abandoned. The Allies lost Shermans too, dozens of them. But by the next morning, replacements were already en route from depots behind the line. It was in those final hours that the captured German crews truly understood what they had seen days before. The tank that had defied their shells, the armor they had called a trick. It wasn't invincibility, it was endurance, multiplied by thousands. That battle near Celle marked the turning point of the Ardennes offensive. The German advance halted. The bulge, once threatening to split the Allied front, began to shrink. The legend of the Tiger and Panther faded, replaced by a new truth, that wars are not won by the best machine, but by the best system to keep machines fighting. As the fires died down and the snow began to fall again, the battlefield fell silent. Among the wrecks, a single Sherman still idled, engine humming softly, its crew too exhausted to shut it off. In that low rumble lay the sound of industrial warfare, steady, relentless, unstoppable. The German officers who saw it didn't speak. They didn't need to. They understood now what their weapons could never achieve. When the smoke finally cleared over the Ardennes, The numbers told the story that propaganda never could. Between December 16, 1944, and January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest engagement ever fought by the U.S. Army. Over 19,000 Americans were killed, nearly 50,000 wounded, and thousands more captured or missing. The Germans suffered even greater losses, an estimated 100,000 casualties, including many of their most experienced tank crews. The once feared Panzer divisions were decimated. The 2nd Panzer, 9th Panzer, and Panzer Lehr divisions, which had formed the armored spearhead of Hitler's offensive, ceased to exist as cohesive fighting forces. Of the hundreds of Panthers and Tigers that had thundered into Belgium with such confidence, barely a handful made it back across the German border. Most were destroyed in combat, abandoned due to lack of fuel, or simply broke down in the bitter cold. For the Americans, the Sherman had proven something that no statistic could measure: reliability under pressure. Its armor was never invincible, its gun never supreme. But its crews could fight, retreat, and return again, often within the same day. When a Sherman was knocked out, salvage teams retrieved it, mechanics repaired it, and within 48 hours it was back on the line. No other tank of the war could match that rhythm. Captured German officers repeatedly expressed disbelief at this logistical tempo. Many had been trained to expect that a single tank loss meant a permanent hole in the line. For the Americans, it was merely a temporary inconvenience. At depots across France and Belgium, hundreds of spare Shermans waited in reserve. Trains and convoys delivered them in endless streams. The front never ran dry. In the reports of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, one note stood out: enemy armor superior in gun and armor, but inadequate in support and endurance. That phrase captured the essence of the entire conflict. The German war machine had pursued technical excellence at the cost of sustainability. The American war machine had pursued functionality at the cost of prestige. And on the battlefield, prestige burned faster than fuel. Among prisoners, stories spread quickly. German tankers whispered about the Sherman that wouldn't die, a phrase passed half in awe, half in despair. The psychological blow was immense. To soldiers raised on the myth of German superiority, seeing a supposedly inferior machine defy their best weaponry was like watching the laws of war unravel. Meanwhile, American crews were not blind to their own losses. Many Shermans still fell prey to the deadly 88 mm guns or ambushes from Panthers lying in wait. For every victory, there were burned-out hulks along the roadside, blackened by fire and shrapnel. But what mattered was what came next. Another crew, another tank, another push forward. The Battle of Celle, in particular, became a textbook case for military academies. Analysts later described it as the perfect embodiment of operational resilience. The Shermans that held their ground there didn't win by technical dominance. They won by attrition, communication, and courage. And courage had become the Sherman's true armor. Even German high command began to acknowledge it. In his post-war interrogations, General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, admitted, "The Americans fought with an efficiency that we could not match. Their tanks were inferior, but their organization made them superior." Those words carried more weight than any shell. They revealed the shift that had already taken place. The age of individual heroism and mechanical perfection was ending, replaced by an era of systems, logistics, and adaptability. As January gave way to February, the Allies surged eastward once again. The snow melted, the roads cleared, and the Shermans rolled forward. The same engines, the same crews, the same relentless momentum. For the Germans left behind, the once revered Tiger and Panther now sat silent, hulking relics of a war they could no longer afford to fight. In the weeks that followed, Allied engineers and intelligence officers combed through the wreckage of the Ardennes. They documented everything: destroyed tanks, abandoned depots, frozen supply lines. What they found confirmed what every soldier on the ground already knew. Germany's last great gamble had failed, not because of courage or even tactics, but because its war machine had collapsed under its own weight. Dozens of captured Panthers and Tigers were inspected, where they had stopped. Some had thrown tracks only a few miles into combat. Others were perfectly intact but empty, their crews having fled after running out of fuel. On many, toolboxes and engine compartments had been stripped bare, cannibalized to keep a few remaining vehicles moving. For every Panther that reached the battlefield, another had been left behind in the mud, abandoned before ever firing a shot. In contrast, American mechanics were busy at work in open fields, welding, refueling, patching bullet holes on Shermans that had fought the day before. The scale of efficiency was staggering. Behind every Sherman platoon stood an entire logistical army: supply trucks, field workshops, spare engines, and rail networks stretching back to ports in Normandy. Even while the Battle of the Bulge raged, new tanks were being unloaded from ships. It was this relentless rhythm that defined modern warfare. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a statement of industrial philosophy. Germany had crafted weapons of awe. America had crafted weapons of endurance. When Allied units pushed east in February 1945, they encountered little of the armored might that had terrified them months before. German commanders now used their surviving tanks defensively, often as immobile artillery pieces. Panthers were dug into hillsides to conserve fuel, firing from concealed positions like bunkers. It was a tragic irony. The most advanced tanks of the war reduced to static defenses, while the simpler Shermans rolled freely through open country. As the Allies advanced toward the Rhine, the psychological balance of the war had shifted completely. American crews who had once feared the sight of a Tiger now viewed them as trophies. A downed Panther or Tiger drew crowds of soldiers taking photographs, their once menacing silhouettes now symbols of a dying empire. In after-action reports, several American officers reflected on the human side of the campaign. One wrote, "We fought men, not machines. Their tanks burned, but they fought well, until the fuel ran out, until the orders stopped coming. Ours kept going." The captured German crews, including Kruger and his men, were eventually sent to POW camps in France. Interrogators noted their fixation on the Sherman tank. Many asked about its armor composition, convinced the Americans had developed a secret alloy. They were shown the truth: standard rolled homogeneous steel, nothing more. The secret wasn't material. It was mathematics, training, and discipline. Those men would spend the remainder of the war in captivity, haunted not by defeat alone, but by disbelief that the machine they once mocked had undone them so completely. By spring 1945, the Sherman's reputation had transformed. It was no longer dismissed as a Ronson or Tommy Cooker. It was now a veteran's tank, proven across deserts, hedgerows, and frozen forests. British and Canadian crews praised its reliability. Soviet commanders, who had received thousands through Lend-Lease, called it a good machine for a long war. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, over 49,000 Shermans had served across every front. Many were still running. The Panther and Tiger, though superior on paper, had become symbols of wasted perfection. Machines too advanced for a nation collapsing under total war. In the end, the numbers themselves told a moral truth. The war had not been won by invincibility, but by resilience, by thousands of crews who learned, adapted, and refused to give up, by a design that accepted imperfection and turned it into unstoppable momentum. The Sherman didn't end the war alone, but it carried an army across continents, through fear and fire, until the sound of its engines echoed through the streets of Berlin itself. And for those who once swore it could never happen, for those who begged to see its armor again, that sound was the final answer. In the long silence after victory, when Europe's battlefields turned once again to farmland, the wrecks remained, rusted shapes half buried in snow and soil. The tiger and panther, once symbols of dominance, now stood as monuments to a war that had outgrown them. The Sherman, meanwhile, rolled on. It became the tank of liberation parades, of occupation forces, of the post-war world that followed. Historians would debate its legacy for decades. Critics called it undergunned, underarmored, a weapon of attrition rather than brilliance. But for those who fought in it, the Sherman was something deeper, a machine that forgave human error, that endured the mud and chaos of modern war, that carried them home when so many others did not. It was not perfection that won, it was persistence. The captured German tank crew who once begged to see the Sherman's armor again were never told the secret they sought, because there wasn't one. No hidden alloy, no trick plating, no invisible advantage. What they witnessed was the power of collective effort, the sum of 1,000,000 factory workers, engineers, and soldiers moving with one purpose. War had changed forever. The future would not belong to the most powerful machine, but to the system that could sustain one. The age of the singular superweapon had ended. The era of industrial mastery and logistical precision had begun. In that sense, the Sherman was not just an American tank. It was the embodiment of modern warfare itself. It proved that simplicity, multiplied by will, could overcome even the most elegant designs of genius. The Panther was a masterpiece. The Tiger was a legend. But the Sherman was a promise that the side which learns faster, adapts better, and never stops moving will always, eventually, prevail. And so, when those captured German tankers ran their hands across its scarred armor, whispering that it must have been a trick, they were half right. It was a trick, not of steel, but of endurance, coordination, and time. Because in the end, wars are not won by the machines that survive the battle, but by the ideas that survive the war.